Got it. That's going, and then great. Yeah, that looks good. Let me do that button. All right, ready for me to open the floodgates?
Yep.
All right. All right, we've got people starting to come in, so we'll give all of you a second to get situated, make sure that you are good to go. But to introduce myself, my name is Ben Falter. I'm the Director of Education at the Ontario County Historical Society. Tonight, we are going to hear from our curator, Wilma Townsend, who is going to talk about women's rights movement in Ontario County and notable figures involved in that. And yeah, we are really excited to share this with all of you. Please just note that we are also live streaming this for YouTube. For anybody who didn't sign up in time to get a link to this, so just be aware of that. Also, I am having everybody's video and audio turned off for this meeting, just so that we don't have too much competing real estate for sound and visual during the course of this presentation that Wilma is going to be giving us. That said, if you have any questions, I will be monitoring the Zoom chat all for the whole presentation. So if you do have any questions for Wilma, please ask them in the Zoom chat. You should be able to do that just by moving your mouse over the screen and hitting the little chat button at the bottom, and then typing in whatever question you have. And like I said, I'll be keeping an eye on that. And at the end of Wilma's presentation, we'll have some time for you to ask any questions that you have. And I will pass those questions on to Wilma. With that though, before I turn things over to Wilma, we are gonna quickly teach you all how to make a drink. So this is of course a history happy hour. And the in preparation for this, I did look at some drinks from an 1862 book called The Bartender's Guide. It was made by Jerry Thomas, known as the father of American mixology. The drink we'll be making tonight is called a Tom Collins gin. It is still a drink that you can easily get today, but it is comes originally, at least, from broader American society, but was first published in this book. So I'll teach you quickly how to make that drink if you don't already know. And if you have the ingredients, you can follow along at home. And then we will get started. Also, real quick, I just want to note that if you find value in this presentation and you have the money to spare, we would love it if you could go to our website and donate so that we can keep providing educational opportunities like this for everybody. But without further ado, let's go ahead and make a drink together. All right, so Tom Collins gin is fairly easy. Only a few ingredients that you really need to make it. Obviously some gin. Now the original Bartender's Guide calls for a wine glass of gin, which is a very imprecise measurement. Based on my research, it seems like it was really referring to a sherry glass. And that is generally going to mean that the recipe is calling for 2 to 3 ounces of gin. So I've got my jigger here. I'll just do 2 of those. That's about 3 ounces. Also calls for 5 dashes of simple syrup or gum syrup. So again, not very precise, just 5 quick dashes. It also calls for about 1 ounce of lemon juice. I've already juiced my lemon here. So again, I'm going to use my jigger to estimate. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then you're just going to fill the rest up with some club soda. And that's it. Easy peasy, nice and refreshing drink, and very enjoyable. All right. So with all that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Wilma to start presenting. So Wilma, go ahead and take it away. And as I said, if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for being here this evening. I'm going to talk about the women's suffrage movement in Ontario County. I'll start with, it was merely 105 years ago in 1917 that the state of New York gave women the right to vote. 3 years later, in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, also called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, was ratified. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So as we celebrate Women's History Month, I'm going to share with you some of the information that we learned about the suffrage movement in Ontario County. We did this a few years ago, and when we had an exhibit on this, and what we found really reflects what was going on in probably hundreds of communities across New York State and the country. And for those of you that aren't as familiar with Ontario County, there are 16 townships in the county, and much of this was, and parts of it are still, largely rural, with numerous small villages and then 2 small cities, Canandaigua and Geneva. So in central and western New York, it was often called the burned over district for its many religious revivals and the simultaneous rise of reform movements for abolition, temperance, education, and women's rights. Many of these causes were advanced in the town of Farmington, led by the Society of Friends, or Quakers. For women, the reform movement meetings offered them their first public platform. So in July 1848, 200 women convened in Seneca Falls for the first Women's Rights Convention. Elizabeth Cady Stanton read the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances, which she had drafted. The declaration detailed the injustices inflicted upon women in the US and called upon women to organize and petition for their rights. 2 weeks later, the Rochester Women's Rights Convention met, where they approved the Declaration of Sentiments, including the controversial call for a woman's right to vote. The Rochester Convention was actually the first public meeting of men and women led by a woman, Abigail Bush. Despite a lot of opposition from many of the people there, including some of the women, that this was not socially or morally acceptable. After some concerted discussion, Abigail Bush competently led the convention, and all future women's rights conventions were presided over exclusively by women. There were at least 4 Ontario County women who attended one or both of these conventions. There was Catherine Fish Stebbins, who was from Farmington and later Rochester. She signed the Declaration of Sentiments in Seneca Falls, and she was the secretary at the convention in Rochester. Rhoda Palmer of Geneva also signed the Declaration, and she was the only signer to live to vote in 1918 in New York State. Laura Arnold Murray was from Victor, and she was the vice president of the Rochester Convention. And then finally, Emily Parmalee Collins attended both conventions and organized the Women's Equal Rights Club in South Bristol in October 1848. What is notable about this is this was the very first such club in the entire nation. So in December 1855, Susan B. Anthony came to Canandaigua to speak to a large crowd at Bemis Hall, which is still standing downtown in Canandaigua. Caroline Cowles Richards was a girl who was raised by her grandparents in Canandaigua and attended the Ontario Female Seminary. So she wrote this passage in her diary. It's a little long, but it's worthwhile. Susan B. Anthony is in town and spoke in Bemis Hall this afternoon. She made a special request that all the seminary girls should come to hear her, as well as all the women and girls in town. She had a large audience, and she talked very plainly about our rights and how we ought to stand up for them, and said the world would never go right until the women had just as much right to vote and rule as the men. She asked us all to come up and sign our names, who would promise to do all in their power to bring about that glad day when equal rights should be the law of the land. A whole lot of us went up and signed the paper. When I told grandmother about this, she said she guessed Susan B. Anthony had forgotten that St. Paul said that women should keep silence. I told her no, she didn't, for she spoke particularly about St. Paul and said that if he had lived in these times instead of 1800 years ago, he would have been as anxious to have the women at the head of the government as she was. I could not make grandmother agree with her at all. And she said we might be better had all of us stayed at home. So during the Civil War, most women reformers and suffragists focused on the war effort, and suffrage activity was pretty much at a minimum. But the war itself served as sort of a training ground for women, learning really important organizational and occupational skills that they would later use in their suffrage activities. In November 1872, Susan B. Anthony voted in Rochester, arguing that the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution gave her that right. The amendment gave the right to vote to any person born or naturalized in the U.S., thus ensuring that those who were formerly enslaved could vote. But voters were defined as male. But she cast her ballot for Ulysses S. Grant in the presidential election. Of 50 other Rochester women who attempted to vote, 15 convinced the election inspectors to allow them to cast their ballots. Anthony was arrested at her home a few weeks later and charged with illegal voting. The next year, in 1873, the United States versus Susan B. Anthony trial was held at the Ontario County Courthouse in Canandaigua. Originally, her trial was to be held in Rochester, but Anthony proceeded to publicly speak in all 29 towns and villages of Monroe County, asking, "Is it a crime for a U.S. citizen to vote?" Worried that her speeches would influence the jury, the district attorney moved the trial to the federal circuit court in Ontario County. Anthony responded to this by speaking in every town and village in Ontario County as well before the trial began. The judge, Justice Ward Hunt, directed the jury to deliver a guilty verdict. When he asked Anthony, who had not been permitted to speak during the trial, if she had anything to say, she responded to that the trial was, quote, a high-handed outrage upon my citizens' rights. You have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all alike ignored. So the work for women's suffrage continued on the national stage. In 1878, a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage was proposed by Senator Aaron A. Sargent of California. And quote, the right of citizens to vote shall not be abridged by the U.S. or by any state on account of sex. Congress responded by forming committees in the House and Senate. And as I've said before, nothing has changed since then to study and debate the issue. When the proposal finally reached the Senate floor in 1886, 8 years later, it was defeated. This same amendment was introduced in every session of Congress for the next 41 years. By 1890, women suffrage leaders had set aside the various differences that they had on how to approach attaining the right to vote. The two major suffrage associations merged to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which is also known as NAWSA. Beginning with about 7,000 members, it eventually increased to 2 million. The new leadership through Carrie, Chapman, Catt, and Dr. Anna Howard Shaw pushed the movement ahead. So with the increased awareness of the suffrage question, meetings were held throughout Ontario County to spread and discuss its merits. In 1894, Susan B. Anthony spoke to a large crowd at the Methodist Church here in Canandaigua. The local newspaper noted, the women's suffrage question is now the all-absorbing topic of conversation among the female element of Canandaigua. At the close of the 2 days meeting, the circulation of petitions was begun, and the signatures of a great majority of the citizens were secured. Since that time, a reaction has set in with a counter petition protesting against striking and out the word male in the Constitution. The instigators of the new movement are acting quietly and are among the most prominent and highly educated element of Canandaigua society. Also in 1894, a meeting was held at the West Bloomfield Town Hall, where local advocates spoke in favor of a woman's right to vote, including local judges and Reverend Annis Eastman of West Bloomfield. Reverend Eastman and her husband, Reverend Samuel Eastman, were ministers at the Congregational Church in West Bloomfield, and their daughter, Crystal Eastman, went on to be a well-known suffragist, lawyer, and reformer. So in the 1890s, Ontario County women and men were well aware of what was going on in the rest of the country and state, but no specific suffrage groups had yet been established. In November 1897, the 29th annual New York State Women's Suffrage Association Convention was held in Geneva, where the featured speakers were Susan B. Anthony and Anna Howard Shaw. It is this convention that led to the formation of the first women's suffrage group in Ontario County, the Geneva Political Equality Club. It became the largest club in the state. The suffrage movement really took hold in the eastern part of the county due to the influence of Geneva residents and activists Elizabeth Smith Miller and her daughter Anne. They were both close cousins of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So between 1898 and 1906, there were 5 political equality clubs were formed, including a county-wide association. The rural town of Richmond was home in the early 1900s to 2 villages, Allen's Hill and Honeoye. And each of these little communities formed their own political equality club in 1906. This town, the town of Richmond, had a legacy of involvement in abolition, temperance, and the rights of women. In the mid-1800s, local people had turned out in droves to hear Frederick Douglass speak at the Honeoye Congregational Church. Honeoye also hosted speaker Matilda Jocelyn Gage, the noted civil rights supporter. Meanwhile, there was a large number of women in the state and in the country who were opposed to women's suffrage. In 1911, the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage was founded. They argued that most women did not want the vote, did not have time to vote or stay updated on politics, lacked the expertise or mental capacity to offer a useful opinion about political issues. Wealthy society women also often opposed suffrage. Many had personal access to powerful politicians and were reluctant to surrender that advantage. The only known local anti-suffrage group in Ontario County was in Geneva. Most of the members were spouses of the wealthiest men in that community. So, encouraged by the success of other suffrage clubs in the county, 2 more clubs were founded in Victor and Gorham in 1913. The Victor Equal Suffrage Association was founded at the home of Miss Mary L. Draper, which was right on Main Street in Victor. Members included school teachers, librarians, a newspaper editor, a public health worker, an artist, and women active in their churches, particularly the Universalist Church. At least 6 women from Victor marched in the 1914 Women's Suffrage Parade held in Rochester. The Gorham Political Equality Club was formed from the Geneva Club. 20 women came to the first meeting. Although Canandaigua did not have a formal political equality club until 1915, local women's clubs such as the Current Events Club actively sought out speakers on women's voting rights. In 1915, the new Canandaigua Political Equality Club hosted the Ontario County Woman Suffrage Association's convention at the newly constructed Ontario County Historical Museum, which is where we are still today. Carrie Chapman Catt was the featured speaker, and over 300 women attended that all-day event and later took part in a march to the courthouse. It's pretty amazing that they managed to have 300 women in this building. Also of note, just related to Canandaigua, the Granger Place School, which is now the Granger Homestead, it was at one time a private school, educated a number of young women who became part of the suffrage movement, including Crystal Eastman and also Edith Houghton. Edith was the aunt of actress Katharine Hepburn. So also in 1915, the same year as the New York State suffrage referendum, 4 more political equality groups were organized in East Bloomfield, Naples, Shortsville, and Port Gibson. In 1916, the Shortsville Club hosted the Ontario County Political Equality Association convention with attendance that completely overflowed their venue space at one of the churches. So the town of Seneca had a small but active political equality club in the village of Seneca Castle. 2 local women most active in the club were Maud Fish and Mary Gray Peck. Maud Fish spoke locally at various clubs and meetings, such as at the Grange and at the Women's Christian Temperance Union meetings. Mary Peck, who graduated from Elmira College, began her career as a professor at the University of Minnesota. She soon dedicated her life to the suffrage movement, women's labor issues, the peace movement, and journalism. She was Carrie Chapman Catt's personal secretary and later wrote Catt's biography. Based in Geneva, the Ontario County Men's League for Women's Suffrage served to advocate for women's suffrage through financial and political support. Members campaigned for the New York State constitutional amendment in both 1915 and 1917. The League placed letters and advertisements in the local newspapers encouraging men to support the cause. Most had spouses or family members involved in the movement. These men were merchants, lawyers, college professors, pastors, New York State assemblymen, court judges, and farmers. So the suffrage parade that was held in New York City was organized by Carrie Chapman Catt and the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And it occurred on October 23rd, 1915. There were over 25,000 women who marched up Fifth Avenue in New York City to advocate for women's suffrage. Mary Gray Peck wrote an exhilarating description in her diary, and I'll read it. Day of the grand parade. Already Fifth Avenue was lined with crowds and the traffic suspended. At 3, the bugles blew the advance. Mrs. Catt led us out onto the avenue, and from then till 7 p.m., the thousands of marchers poured out into the square. The last weary ones reached the park at 8 p.m., 5 hours after. Union League Club greeted us with a sight of our own members heading the men's division. The men's league sang John Brown's Body to the words, "We will vote for women's suffrage due next election day. Glory, hallelujah." Socialist men chanted, "Votes, votes, votes for women," to mark time. 30 bands, women in white with yellow sashes. Mrs. Catt walked all the way, as did Anna Shaw. 1 million people watched us. However, on election day, November 2nd in 1915, the women's vote referendum in New York State was turned down. It took 2 more years to attain the vote in this state and 5 more years nationally. Entry of the U.S. into World War I in April 1917 had a significant impact on the suffrage movement. As men went to war, women took on non-traditional jobs. Suffrage leaders helped with the war effort and won additional sympathy for the suffrage cause. A small group of militant suffragists led by Alice Paul picketed the White House, urging Woodrow Wilson to support a constitutional amendment to give women the right to vote. Wilson had been previously reluctant to fulfill to fully endorse the suffrage movement, particularly in his 1916 presidential campaign. So just days before the 1917 New York State referendum for women's suffrage, Carrie Chapman Catt and Dr. Anna Howard Shaw led another New York City parade to gain support. The placards that you can see the women carrying on the right had over 1 million signatures demanding New York women's right to vote. And quite a few women traveled from Ontario County down to New York City to march in this parade. So on Election Day, November 7th, 1917, New York State voters granted full women's suffrage. The referendum was carried by an 80,000 vote majority. There were now 2 million new voters in New York State. Our state was the first Eastern state to fully enfranchise women. So this is the official canvass for votes cast in Ontario County for the November 1917 vote. Despite the winning vote for suffrage in New York State, Ontario County voted the amendment down. You need to remember that only men were voting. The only town to vote in favor of the amendment was the town of Seneca, the hometown of suffragist Mary Gray Peck. Many other rural state counties also voted down the referendum, but it was carried in part due to the passing of the referendum in Buffalo, Albany, and New York City. So 3 years later, on August 14th, 1920, the 19th Amendment was finally ratified. The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Ontario County was one of hundreds of counties across the country where the grassroots efforts of women energized and educated the public and transformed the fight for women's rights. The Ontario County Suffrage History Project that we conducted from about 2015 to 17 helped to preserve this legacy. And again, I put my thanks out to the municipal historians and the local historical societies of this county and all the volunteers who gave so much time and effort conducting all the research for the project and helping this to become a success. So that concludes my story, and if there are questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
All right, great. So yeah, as Wilma said, if you have any questions, please ask them in the Zoom chat while we are waiting for some questions. Just as a quick ask, I guess, if you feel like you learned something from this and are able to, we would love it if you could go to OCHS.org and donate what you are able so we can continue to put on excellent programs like this in the future. Our first question in chat: will this video be made public and shared? Yes, this video will be made available on our YouTube channel in a couple weeks' time. And we are live streaming it on YouTube right now as well. But I'll make sure that a nice clean version goes up on our YouTube channel in a couple weeks, and we'll update our social media profiles when that happens, so you know when it goes available. We have a question from Cody. Can you speak to the broader influence on these women? Did they encourage other groups outside of the county, state, region?
I'm not really sure specifically, but I think particularly the Geneva group probably had some of the greatest influence on the surrounding counties, in particular because of their links to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her relatives that lived near that city.
Great, great. First of all, Wilma, I just want to let you know we've got several people letting you know that they really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
We have a couple other questions for you. Next from Lois. Can you explain the colored legends in the final map of various levels of suffrage?
Let's see if I can look at it. Yeah, there were suffrage, enfranchisement of women sort of came in phases. So some states had suffrage rights for women for voting for schools, the school bonds or taxes, or even in some cities. And then others had it just for presidential suffrage, but then others gave full suffrage. And ironically, the ones that had full suffrage first were out in the West. I think Wyoming was one of the first to do that.
Great. Just a question from me. Do you know why the Western states were introduced suffrage earlier?
I think it was in part because there was a higher level of equality out there, because it was essentially a frontier area. So women were doing just as many difficult chores and activities as the men. So the playing field was a little more level.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, question from Pat. Were many of the women mothers? And if so, who took care of the kids?
Yes, I think a number of them were, but actually a number of them, many of the women who were very actively involved towards the end of the push to get the vote through were women in their 40s and 50s. So the kids were grown up or were old enough to take care of themselves. So they had the time and the opportunity to go out and work on this. There were a couple I saw when I was doing some research on this very topic of how did these women manage to do this, that I believe they probably left their young children with family members.
Right. Question from Melissa. Do you think Farmington didn't have a club because it was so sparsely populated?
Possibly. It may also be that there were quite a few women active in the suffrage movement there. We just never found anything specific about a club. But you know, the Quakers were so involved with women's rights and all the other social movements that were going on at the time that, you know, they may have had something going on, and it may have been linked to their church, and I just didn't find it, or nobody else found that specific aspect of how they were getting their voice out there.
We have a question from unnamed person in chat. Could you tell us what you know about how the women interacting with the Indian nation's matriarchal societies influenced the Seneca Falls Convention?
I didn't go too far into that, but I think there, you know, there was some influence of the way the Native Americans, the Iroquois had their their matriarchy, but I didn't dive into that enough to really be able to answer that question.
Great. Another question from an unnamed person in chat. How did the suffragists finally get the male vote in the other counties that originally did not support women's suffrage?
I'm not sure what the person's asking. If they, you know, most of the rural counties voted it down, but many, you know, there were many women that had strong support from their spouses and their family. But the majority of it came out of the bigger cities, like Albany, Rochester, Syracuse.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any other questions that people have in chat? I want to make sure that if anybody has any questions, they get to ask them. Let me quickly pop over and look at the YouTube chat. If you are watching us on YouTube and you have any questions, also feel free to ask those in the YouTube chat if you have them. And I'll wait for a second for the stream to catch up. We'll see if we've got any more questions. But thank you again, Wilma. Like I said, several people in chat have expressed that they have been enjoying the live stream, and we're getting several more mentions now as well about how good it was and how interesting it was. So
good.
Thank
you.
Just want to pass that along to you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Thank you. Great. All right. Are there any final questions for Wilma before we bring this to an end?
I guess I could add one more thing. We do
Sure.
have a book that goes into a lot more detail than what I have just spoken about women's suffrage in Ontario County, and we do have it for sale here. And I think you can also get it, you can read it on our website as well.
Great. I do have one quick question from an unnamed person in the chat. Were you aware that Seneca Falls Convention signer Elisha Foote was a chairman of the Seneca County canvasses in 1848?
No. Okay.
Interesting. All right.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that's if you're the person who asked that question in chat and you have more knowledge about that, please feel free to stop into the Ontario County Historical Society sometime. We'd love to chat to you.
Is that it? May be the husband of, I can't remember the person's first name, but Foote. She was a physicist who was from East Bloomfield.
Great. Yes. Well, thank you, Eunice, for that information. That's very interesting. Writing a biography about her, actually, it sounds like. So.
Oh yeah, Eunice Foote. I just couldn't remember the first name, but that's yeah. So yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
All right. Great. Well, I think this is a good place to end it then. Thank you so much, Wilma, for presenting. It was very good, very, very good information. And thank you, everybody who tuned in and watched this. I hope this was fun and informative for you. And hopefully we'll be able to do more things like this in the future. And as I said before, if you are able, we would love it if you could go to OCHS.org and hit that donate button for us to help us continue putting on educational programming like this. I've been Ben. And thank you again, Wilma, for presenting.
Yep.
And we
Thank
will
you.
bring our virtual happy hour to an end.